I've always been the kind of man who notices the little things. A slight change in someone's tone, the way their eyes flicker when they're caught in a lie, the unnatural stiffness in their smile when they're pretending everything is fine. Some call it paranoia. I call it survival. That night, I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I was just another husband at another fancy event, holding a glass of something overpriced while my wife, Sabine, worked the room like she always did. She had a way of making people feel special, as if they were the only ones in the world when she spoke to them. It was one of the things that drew me to her in the first place. But now, as I watched from across the room, I realized she was giving that same look to someone else. At first, it was subtle. A laugh that was a little too soft. A hand that lingered a little too long. The way her body angled toward him, as if she were drawn to him without realizing it. But I realized it. I saw everything. Then came the whisper. It was quick, barely audible over the music and chatter, but I saw the way her lips moved near his ear, the way his eyes darkened with something unspoken. I don't know why, but that whisper hit me harder than anything else. It was the moment I knew. This wasn't just friendly conversation. This was something more. I didn't react. Not yet. I wasn't the kind of man who made a scene. Instead, I watched. I let the weight of the realization settle into my bones, heavy and cold. I thought about our home, our life, the years we had spent building something I thought was unshakable. And I thought about how, in just a few moments, she had taken all of it and made it feel like a lie. Then, as if she could sense me watching, Sabine turned. Our eyes met across the room. For the briefest second, there was something in her gaze, guilt, maybe, or fear. Then, just like that, she smiled. A practiced, perfect smile, as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, and she knew it. Without a word, she set down her glass and turned toward the exit. She didn't make a scene, didn't try to explain. She just walked away, as if she could erase what had just happened by leaving. Maybe she thought I'd stay silent. Maybe she thought I'd pretend I hadn't seen what I saw. She was so wrong. I watched the door swing shut behind her, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, but I wasn't crushed by it. Not yet. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. I sat there for a moment, watching the door sway gently before it settled shut. The sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the distant hum of music filled the space she had just left. But in my mind, it was dead silent. My wife, my Sabine, had seen the truth in my eyes and fled. That alone told me everything I needed to know. A woman who had nothing to hide wouldn't have run. She would have marched over to me with that effortless confidence of hers, smiled, and asked why I was staring at her so strangely. But Sabine didn't do that. She left, like a child caught stealing candy, hoping that if she disappeared quickly enough, the crime wouldn't stick. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around my glass. My instinct was to follow her, to get answers. But what answers would she even give me? Lies? Excuses? Some half-hearted attempt at gaslighting me into believing my own eyes had deceived me? No, not yet. Instead, I turned my attention back to the man she had been whispering to. He was still at the bar, sipping his drink like nothing had happened. He didn't follow her out. He wasn't nervous. That, more than anything, made my stomach twist. He was too comfortable, too familiar with this game. Who was he? I hadn't seen him before, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. He wasn't young, wasn't old, maybe in his mid-40s, like me. His suit was expensive but not flashy, his hair graying at the temples in a way that probably worked in his favor. He had that kind of easy, practiced charisma that men like me instinctively mistrust. A part of me wanted to walk over there, sit down, and just ask. But I knew better. So I watched. I watched him finish his drink, glance casually at his phone, and then, after a moment, rise from his seat. He wasn't in a hurry, but he wasn't lingering either. Just another man wrapping up his night. He adjusted his cufflinks, nodded at someone he recognized, and then made his way toward the exit. I let him go. Not because I wasn't curious, but because something told me that this wasn't the time for confrontation. There were still too many missing pieces, and if I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. Instead, I reached for my phone. I opened my text and scrolled until I found Sabine's name. My thumb hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed out something simple. Me, where are you? No response. I waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. Nothing. I clenched my jaw. Fine. If she wasn't going to answer, I'd find her myself. I stood, downed the last of my drink, and made my way outside. The night air was sharp against my skin, but I barely noticed. My mind was moving too fast, running through every possibility, every scenario. Had she gone home? Had she met up with him somewhere else? Was this the first time, or just the first time I'd noticed? I pulled out my phone again, this time opening the tracking app we had installed years ago, one of those Find My Family apps that was supposed to be for emergencies. Sabine never turned hers off. She said it made her feel safe. I tapped her name. A second later, a map popped up. She wasn't home. She wasn't at any place that made sense, either. She was at a hotel. I stared at the screen, the little blue dot hovering over a name I recognized, a boutique hotel not far from here, one she had mentioned once in passing. My pulse pounded in my ears. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I had misunderstood everything. But deep down, I already knew. I flagged down a cab, slid into the back seat, and gave the driver the address. One way or another, I was getting my answer tonight. The cab ride felt both endless and too short. I sat in the back, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The glowing blue dot on the screen mocked me. I watched it, waiting for it to move, hoping, maybe even praying, that she would leave the hotel before I got there. That this was all some ridiculous misunderstanding, some coincidental mistake. But Sabine wasn't moving. She was still there. When the driver pulled up to the hotel, I didn't get out right away. I just stared at the entrance, the warm, welcoming glow of the lobby lights making the entire scene feel surreal. I had been here before, once, a few years back, when we had a weekend getaway. It was a beautiful place, intimate and expensive, the kind of hotel meant for people looking to escape reality. It had never crossed my mind that she would use it for something like this. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady my nerves. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I stepped out of the cab and into the night. Inside, the lobby was quiet, save for the soft jazz playing over hidden speakers. A woman at the front desk glanced up, giving me a polite smile. "Good evening, sir." Checking in. I forced a smile, shaking my head. "Actually, I think my wife is staying here. I was supposed to meet her, but my phone died. Could you remind me of the room number?" She hesitated, her expression shifting slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't give out guest information." Of course, I cut in, nodding. I completely understand. That was expected, but I didn't need her to tell me. I just needed a hint. So, instead of pushing, I did something else. I turned slightly, glancing down at the open registry on the desk. Just for a second. Just long enough. And there it was. Sabine's name. Room 308. I didn't react. I just nodded at the receptionist again, murmured a thanks, and turned toward the elevators. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside and pressed the button for the third floor. The doors slid shut, enclosing me in silence. My mind raced, torn between anger, disbelief, and something else, something I didn't want to name yet. The elevator dinged softly as it arrived, and I stepped out into the hallway. Plush carpeting, dim lighting, walls lined with framed black and white photographs. It was too quiet, too still. I walked, slow and steady, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Then I saw it. Room 308. The door wasn't fully shut. A crack of light spilled into the hallway, casting a thin golden glow on the floor. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at that tiny gap. My breath was shallow, my pulse hammering against my ribs. This was it. Whatever was on the other side of that door would change everything. I lifted a hand, rested my fingers against the wood. Then, without knocking, without giving myself time to hesitate, I pushed the door open. The room was warm, lit by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. And standing there, barefoot on the plush carpet, wearing nothing but a silk robe loosely tied at the waist, was Sabine. Her face paled the second she saw me. "Lowell." She froze, her entire body going rigid, as if her brain was still catching up to what her eyes were seeing. And then, slowly, so very slowly, she took a step back. I said nothing, because at that moment, words weren't necessary. The truth was already right in front of me. Sabine's mouth opened, but no words came out. I didn't step inside. I didn't need to. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, laced with something unspoken yet undeniable. The scent of her perfume, one I knew all too well, was heavier than usual, mingling with the faintest trace of cologne that didn't belong to me. My eyes drifted past her, scanning the space behind her. The bed was made, but not perfectly. The sheets were pulled slightly, the pillows not quite in place. On the nightstand, 2 glasses of wine, one still half full. She knew. She knew that I saw everything. "Lowell," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't rush to explain, didn't try to deny it. She just stood there, frozen in place, like a cornered animal calculating its next move. I should have said something, should have demanded an explanation, should have yelled, should have done something other than just stand there, watching my wife in a silk robe in a hotel room that wasn't meant for me. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch. She took another step back, one hand lifting to the tie at her waist, pulling it just a little tighter as if that would somehow shield her from the reality of the situation. She started, then stopped. She swallowed, her throat working as she tried to find words that wouldn't come. And still, I said nothing. I wasn't going to help her find an excuse. She could feel the weight of my stare, the way it pinned her in place, and it rattled her more than if I had started shouting. Because Sabine wasn't afraid of anger. She wasn't afraid of conflict. But silence? That was something she didn't know how to fight. The seconds dragged on. I could hear movement somewhere deeper in the suite, the faintest rustle of fabric, a shifting sound, someone trying to stay perfectly still. I already knew. I already knew that whoever had been here with her was still here. Hiding. Waiting. A wave of something cold washed over me. Not anger. Not even betrayal. Something worse. Clarity. I let out a slow breath, tilting my head slightly as I studied her. So, that one word was quiet, but it made her flinch. So, I repeated. This is where we are now. She opened her mouth, shut it again. I could see her mind scrambling, searching for a way to spin this, to mold reality into something she could control. But she wasn't in control anymore. I was. And I had a choice. I could throw open the closet door, drag out whoever was in there, demand answers, make a scene. Or, I could do something far worse. I could turn and walk away. Leave her there. Let her feel the weight of what she had done. She wanted me to react. She wanted a fight, a way to shift the blame, a way to twist this into something she could use against me later. I wasn't going to give her that. Instead, I exhaled slowly, straightened my jacket, and took a single step back toward the door. Her eyes widened. Wait. I met her gaze, steady and unblinking. But I didn't wait. I turned. And I walked away. The last thing I heard as I stepped into the hallway was the sound of her breath hitching sharp, like the realization had just hit her. She thought I'd make a scene. She thought I'd lash out. She thought I'd give her something to fight against. She was so wrong. Because silence was far more powerful. And this? This was only the beginning. The elevator doors slid shut, trapping me in a silence that felt heavier than the air in that hotel room. I could still see Sabine's face in my mind, her parted lips, the way her fingers had tightened around the belt of her robe, the sheer panic in her eyes when I turned away instead of unleashing my anger. I leaned against the cold metal wall, pressing my palms against my thighs, exhaling slowly. The weight in my chest wasn't rage. It wasn't even betrayal, not really. It was something else. Something worse. Finality. This wasn't just some argument that could be patched up. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained away. That door had been open, just enough for me to see exactly what was going on. Just enough for me to understand that I had lost something tonight. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped out into the lobby, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The woman at the front desk barely glanced at me as I walked past, her fingers tapping away at a keyboard, oblivious to the fact that someone's marriage had just fallen apart under the soft glow of these chandeliers. Outside, the city was alive. Cars zipped by, people laughed as they spilled out of bars, taxis honked impatiently at the late-night crowd. It felt wrong, somehow, that the world was still moving, that it hadn't stopped along with my heartbeat the moment I stepped into that room. I flagged down a cab, slid into the back seat, and gave the driver my address. The ride home was suffocating. The cab smelled like cheap air freshener and worn leather, but I barely noticed. My hands rested on my thighs, fingers twitching slightly, as my mind replayed everything I had seen. The hotel. The door slightly ajar. Sabine standing there in her robe, her breath catching in her throat when she saw me. And the sound, the faintest shuffle of movement from somewhere in that room. I should have done something. That thought gnawed at me, burrowed into my brain, and refused to let go. I should have called her out. Should have walked into the room, grabbed the stranger by the collar, and demanded to know who the hell he was. But I didn't. Because I already knew it wouldn't have changed anything. I clenched my jaw and turned to stare out the window. The city lights blurred past, casting strange patterns against the glass. A memory hit me then sharp, sudden. 3 months ago. A conversation we had in the kitchen while she poured herself a glass of wine. "You've been distant lately," she had said, tilting her head slightly. "Is something wrong?" I had laughed, shaking my head. "No, just work stuff." And she had smiled. Not her usual, easy smile. No, it had been something more calculated. Something meant to reassure me just a little too much. You know you can talk to me, right? She had said. Now, looking back, I realized what that moment had been. She hadn't been worried about me. She had been worried about whether I was starting to notice. The cab pulled up to my house. I paid the driver, climbed out, and stood there for a moment, staring at the front door. The porch light was off. Sabine had always been the one to turn it on when she knew I was coming home late. Not tonight. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, and let the quiet settle around me. The house felt different. Not physically, it was the same furniture, the same faint smell of vanilla candles she always kept burning, but something was off. I was alone in it. And for the first time, I realized I had probably been alone for a lot longer than I thought. I moved through the house on autopilot, loosening my tie, kicking off my shoes. My body was exhausted, but my mind was too sharp, too alive, refusing to let me rest. Then, as I stepped into our bedroom, my eyes landed on something that made my chest tighten. Sabine's vanity. Her jewelry box sat on top, half open. Inside, tangled among her bracelets and necklaces, was her wedding ring. She hadn't been wearing it. Not at the party. Not at the hotel. A bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. She had already decided, long before I ever walked into that hotel room. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my thighs, and let the truth settle in. This marriage was over. She just hadn't bothered to tell me yet. The house was quiet, too quiet. Not in the comforting way it used to be, when Sabine and I would sit in separate rooms, lost in our own worlds but still sharing the same space. No, this silence felt hollow, like an abandoned place that had long since lost its meaning. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her jewelry box, the glint of her wedding ring catching the faint glow of the bedside lamp. It was there, buried beneath a mess of earrings and bracelets, tossed aside like an afterthought. That was what hurt the most. Not the hotel room. Not the way she had looked at me, frozen in shock. Not even the fact that another man had been there, hiding, waiting for me to leave. No, it was this. This tiny detail. The fact that she had already taken it off before the night even began. A deep breath shuddered through me. I leaned forward, pressing my elbows to my knees, trying to will myself into clarity. But all I could think about was the past. How long had she been planning this? I tried to rewind time in my mind, picking apart the little moments, searching for the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. Was it last month, when she started dressing up more for work dinners, but never seemed interested in putting in the same effort for our date nights? Was it last summer, when we took a trip to the coast, and I caught her staring at her phone more than the ocean? Or was it earlier, before I even noticed? I should have noticed. I stood up abruptly, my pulse pounding against my temples. I needed air. Space. Anything to stop the thoughts from unraveling me. I left the bedroom and walked down the hall, my footsteps muffled against the hardwood floors. Every inch of this house was a reminder of her, of us. The framed photos on the wall, the blanket she always curled up with on the couch, the scent of her lingering in the air. It was unbearable. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door without thinking, stepping into the cold night air. Where was she now? Still at the hotel? Did she go back inside after I left? Or was she in some car, parked in the shadows, trying to figure out how to talk her way out of this? I didn't know. And I didn't care. At least, that's what I told myself. I got into my car, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind was a whirlwind, spinning between anger, betrayal, and something far worse, emptiness. I drove. No destination, no plan. Just street lights and open roads, the city passing by in a blur. The further I got from home, the more it felt like I was escaping something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because you can't escape something that's already inside you. Somewhere between one empty street and another, my phone buzzed against the console. The sound nearly made me jump. I glanced at the screen, and my breath caught in my throat. Sabine. For a long second, I didn't move. Then, slowly, I reached for the phone and answered. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. For a moment, there was only silence. Heavy, suffocating, filled with everything we weren't saying. Then, finally, her voice came through, quiet and unsure. Lowell. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. You left the party. It wasn't a question. I heard her inhale sharply. She hesitated. Where are you? I ignored the question. Did you go back inside? Silence. That told me everything I needed to know. I let out a breath, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. You didn't even leave, did you? Another pause. Then, softer, no. Of course she didn't. She had waited. Waited until she was sure I was gone. Waited until she thought it was safe. Then, she had gone right back to whatever it was she had planned. The weight of that realization settled deep in my chest. I wasn't part of the equation anymore. I wasn't even a factor. She had already made her choice. I closed my eyes for a long moment, then exhaled. I'll be home late. Lowell, please. I hung up. I set the phone down, staring at the empty road ahead. I could have driven anywhere that night. But for the first time, home didn't feel like a place I belonged. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly, my thoughts tangled in a storm of memories and unspoken truths. The city stretched out around me, neon signs flickering against the dark sky, streets filled with people who had no idea their lives were intact, while mine was falling apart in slow motion. At some point, I found myself in front of a diner, one of those late-night spots with cracked vinyl booths and a smell of coffee that never quite fades. It was the kind of place Sabine would never set foot in. Too ordinary. Too real. I pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly. The woman behind the counter barely glanced at me as I slid into a booth by the window. I stared outside, watching the occasional car pass by, my fingers tapping against the table. I wasn't hungry, but I needed something to ground me. Something other than the sinking realization that my marriage was over, and I had no idea what came next. A waitress appeared at my table, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile. "What can I get you, hon?" I hesitated, then gestured toward the coffee pot in her hand. "Just coffee." She nodded, pouring a steaming cup before walking away. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the heat seep into my fingers. And then, almost as if the universe had a cruel sense of humor, my phone buzzed again. Sabine. For a long moment, I just stared at her name on the screen. I should have ignored it. Should have let it go to voicemail. But I didn't. I answered, bringing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Her voice was tight, almost breathless. "Where are you? Why do you care?" My own voice surprised me, flat, devoid of the emotion I actually felt. I need to talk to you." I took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness settling on my tongue. "Then talk. Not over the phone." "Why not?" Another pause. Then, quietly, "Because I don't know what to say yet." I let out a humorless laugh. "That makes two of us." She exhaled sharply, frustrated. "Lowell, please." "Please what, Sabine?" I cut in, my patience thinning. "Please pretend I didn't see what I saw? Please act like tonight never happened? Or should I let you come up with some carefully rehearsed excuse first?" "That's not fair." I scoffed. "And what part of this is?" Silence. I pressed my fingers against my temple, trying to push away the pounding ache forming there. "Is he still with you?" I could hear the sharp intake of her breath. "Lowell, just answer the question." More silence. And that was my answer. I closed my eyes, leaning back in the booth, my grip tightening around the phone. "I think I finally understand something," I murmured. She hesitated. "What?" I opened my eyes, staring blankly at my reflection in the window. "Why you left the party so fast?" She didn't respond. "You weren't afraid of what I'd do," I continued. "You were afraid of what I wouldn't do." "That's not true, isn't it?" I exhaled. "You were hoping I'd get angry. You wanted a fight, something loud and dramatic so you could twist this into something it's not. But I didn't give you that, did I?" Still nothing. I took another sip of coffee. "I hope he was worth it." Her breath hitched. "Lowell, don't. I'll come home when I feel like it," I said flatly. "Or maybe I won't. Either way, I don't think it matters anymore." I ended the call before she could say another word. The moment I set my phone down, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't heartbroken. Not anymore. No, this was something else. Something like freedom. The sun was just beginning to rise when I finally turned onto my street. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. As I pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath, letting the early morning stillness settle around me. I had spent the night driving with no real destination, stopping only when exhaustion finally weighed down on me. And somewhere between the miles and the hours, something inside me had changed. I wasn't returning to the same life I had left. Sabine's car was in the driveway. She was home, probably waiting for me, rehearsing whatever speech she had planned to smooth things over. But I wasn't interested in her explanations anymore. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. My hands were steady as I unlocked it and stepped inside. The house smelled the same, like vanilla and the faintest trace of her perfume, but it no longer felt like ours. It felt like just another place I had outgrown. I heard movement from the living room. Then, a hesitant voice. Lowell. She stood near the couch, still in the clothes from last night, her expression unreadable. You're back, she said softly. I nodded, shutting the door behind me. Yeah. She took a slow step forward. Can we talk? I met her gaze, and for the first time, I wasn't filled with anger or sadness. Just clarity. There's nothing left to talk about, I said simply. Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that. Lowell, I held up a hand, cutting her off. No, Sabine. Whatever you were going to say, save it. I don't need to hear it. She blinked, her composure wavering. So that's it. I exhaled, letting the final weight of this marriage fall from my shoulders. Yeah, I said. That's it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making the right choice. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need some dramatic confrontation. I just needed to walk away. Turning toward the stairs, I spoke one last time. I'll be packing my things today. I think it's best if I move on. She stood there, silent, as I made my way upstairs. As I packed, I expected to feel regret. I expected the memories to claw at me, to make me question my decision. But all I felt was relief. By the time I zipped up my last bag, I knew this was the best thing that could have happened to me. She had freed me. She thought she had broken me, but in reality, she had given me a gift. A new beginning. As I carried my bags to the car, I felt lighter than I had in years. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. Because life wasn't over. It was just getting started.